Hi, my name is Paul Nell. I'm CEO of 7 Second Solar. We believe solar should be the only source of energy for our planet, and we try to advance that through our software platform AuditPV that we are developing to enhance and improve the design of utility-scale solar, as well as through a global discussion around the changes and the movements in the solar space throughout the world. Today's episode is about solar PV storage and how that is changing and developing into the future. Welcome to Solar Shifts. Super excited today to welcome three very interesting guests to our Solar Shifts podcast from across the world today. So it's really a global discussion, which is really where we want to take it. And I would first like to start off by welcoming Professor Bruce Mountain. Bruce is based out of Victoria, Melbourne. He's a professor at the University of Victoria and also director of Victoria Energy Policy Centre. And he's had decades of experience in the economics and the policy of energy across the world, going back all the way to the 90s. So very, very welcome, Bruce. I'm very happy to have you on the show.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
And then out of beautiful city of Sevilla, we've got Gonzalo Martin Barrera. Gonzalo is currently the commercial director at Atlantica. It's I guess mostly Spanish-based company, Gonzalo, but also active in the UK. And it's one of those companies that's really invested in renewable energy, owning, managing and developing projects. Many of those also storage projects, which is the topic we'd be chatting about today. And Gonzalo has worked literally across the world on solar storage projects, a lot of CSP work, across Africa, Europe, including Italy, Spain, and I think most recently the UK. So, super excited to have you on the show, Gonzalo. Very welcome.
Paul, it's a pleasure being here.
And then with me in studio, so I'm not all on my own, we've got James Larmouth. James started his career really at the cutting edge of solar technology, I guess, in the R&D space with a startup looking at heliostats and solar tracking, solar tracker design. Since then, James has been very involved with CSP, specifically around the South African market, which is a super exciting market in solar and CSP. Being involved in one of the first, if it's not the first, big CSP in South Africa, Kahu Solar One facility. James is currently technical director at Zutari, which is Africa's largest engineering firm. So, James, good to have you on the show. Thanks very much for joining me.
Yeah.
So, we're talking today about, I think, one of the really critical technologies within solar and renewable development, which is storage. And Bruce, I think I'd like to start with you, and I would like to start in Australia because I've got a sense a lot of stuff started in Australia around storage. I want to take it back to 2016, South Australia. There was a series of significant blackouts at that time. And what followed was, I guess, what caused the real shift in storage and grid-connected storage. Renewables went through a bit of a blame game at that point where everyone said, well, it's renewables, it's not renewables. And we even have a little bit of celebrity spin on it with that famous comment from Elon Musk on Twitter saying that I'll build 100 megawatt hour within storage within 100 days or your money back, right? What actually happened? It happened, right? So leading to, I think, what's today Hornsdale Power Reserve. But that was really pivotal. And maybe you can just give us a little bit of background and how that event or any of the others shaped storage, PV storage and grid-connected storage in Australia.
Yeah, certainly. I must say it takes me back at a decade ago now, and the absolutely vicious energy policy debates. They're just as vicious now, a decade later, but things have changed so massively. South Australia of all the states in the south and eastern corner of Australia, has made the most rapid transition to wind and solar generation of all of them, largely because they had a brown coal dominated electrical system, and the brown coal and gas, and the brown coal generators were reaching the end of their life very quickly. A north-south power system in which wind generation could access that strong transmission to get electricity down to Adelaide, strong interconnection to Victoria as well. And a South Australian government, whether Conservative or Liberal or Labor, was quite keen to reduce market power of AGL, the dominant electricity producer, because when they privatized AGL or their power sector roughly 15 years earlier, they maximized the auction proceeds. And part of that deal was essentially granting a whole lot of market power to AGL. And so the government felt powerless to intervene at a policy level to undermine AGL, but they felt that they could incentivize new generation. And so they took advantage of what were then national subsidy schemes available to wind and solar, essentially. Permit schemes, you get a credit for every unit of electricity production that you produce. And so there was a disproportionate investment in wind in particular, and then later in farmed solar in South Australia. But their power system, with declining coal generation, increasingly unreliable, gas generation was phenomenally expensive and very concentrated market power, was then subject to quite a number of severe weather events. And the particular outage in 2016, I actually recall it well because my phone went off the hook with television studios calling for interviews to explain what was going on. It was just a crazy time trying to figure out who did what to whom. Turns out that it was the ride through protection settings of some wind farms, which cascading failure of a transmission lines caused a frequency spike and voltage issues, which led to cascading outages of wind farms because their protection settings weren't quite right. And so anti-renewable lobby jumped in and said, this is all about renewables. And the other side said, no, it's a major transmission outage. And even if it was renewables, it's not anything to do with wind. It's just the protection sitting on the wind farms. And the wind farmer's owner didn't know about it, and the system operator didn't know about it. In all of this melee, and the lights went out, the common sentiment, why don't we have enough storage? Well, South Australia doesn't have hydro. Can we build another interconnector? No, it takes far too long and it's far too expensive. Well, then we should have storage. And of course, Elon Musk, being the adept individual he is, jumped on and said, I will build 50 megawatts within 60 days. And if it's not operational in that time, I will fund it myself. People didn't realize then large-scale lithium storage came in a container, and the essential task was to pour the concrete for it to sit on and plug it into a substation. And so it was a matter of shipping it there, and the rest was either done or not done. Who knows really what the truth of the matter was, but ostensibly here was a battery able to link to the power system and produce and withdraw electricity very quickly as lithium does. And so that was a real eye-opener. And very quickly people said, oh, yes, it can do it, but it's at such a tiny proportion of the peak demand. And so it's not really going to make a difference, only 1 hour. And not long after, they expanded it to 150 megawatts, and then another 5 or 10 batteries of similar size were under construction within a year. And now Australia has operational about 3,000 megawatts and 4,500 megawatt hours of production. This time next year, there'll be 8,000 megawatts in a system with average demand of 25,000 megawatts. So it's now starting to play a very significant role in transmission backup, in frequency response, where it completely dominates the market, very rapid response. And now in South Australia in particular, you're seeing the diurnal shifting, the regular sun in the middle of the day to evening shifting, much as you see in Texas and certainly in large part on the west coast of the US.
So you would say that it was really the outage that triggered significant investment and I guess a change in perception around what utility scale storage could do in Australia. That was really the pivotal point.
Yeah, these things, obviously they're so deeply technical, but more than that, in the corridors of power, it's something demonstrated. Lithium ion, or does it work, doesn't it work, or does a Prius work as a can EV work? Suddenly someone demonstrates 50 megawatts and they say, oh, but it's tiny, but you can build it very quickly and you can build more of it. And actually, it's per unit of, if it's cycled frequently, per unit of stored electricity. It's really, even then, 2016, the only game in town. Pumped hydro had no reasonable prospect. Even now, it's been out competed. And pumped hydro is actually resorting ever more to calculations of the upstream water reservoir capability for Snowy 2, which means nothing because it's a cascade hydro system with a whole lot of pumped hydro downstream, and getting the water from one river system to the other becomes incredibly complex. So policy has kind of observed it and said, let's put subsidies to encourage this. But, in the corridors of power, they like to turn huge knobs. And so there's been a big, let's also have pumped hydro, or pumped hydro is much better, but they've thrown enormous R&D dollars at pumped hydro and it's just getting nowhere. So batteries, lithium batteries, and now perhaps also sodium is, where it's at. It's completely won the argument.
So James, maybe over to the South African market. I think South Africa's probably a leader in managing rolling power curtailments, right? We even managed to create a new name for it, load shedding. It's probably going to be included in some Oxford dictionary at some point. But this was particularly prevalent maybe 3, 4, maybe not even that long ago, years ago. Has that shaped the thinking in South Africa around policy, around resources, funding, specifically around storage in South Africa? I mean, a lot of us have storage in our homes, right? But has this moved the dial for utility scale storage in South Africa?
Yeah, I believe it has. We've had, when we had the first really bad load shedding, 2022, 2023, we were seeing, I think in some cases, 6 to 8 hours a day of residential homes being cut from power, and on quite sort of regular frequency. I think everybody was very much up in arms about it. And you're right. I think our utility had probably a very good handle on managing it, and have become, like you said, the best at doing so. But a lot of our large industries and heavy load centers saw this as a massive risk to their businesses. So there was a lot of movement to try and look at what embedded generators would look like. And unlike what Bruce has explained, our battery market and our energy storage market's not as mature as Australia's. This is 2022, 2023. We're aware of batteries, battery technology. Cost was still relatively high compared to what it is now. And we did a lot of work doing feasibility studies, looking at what these embedded generators would look like for large mines, large consumers. But it was a slightly different discussion to what it is now. Back then, it was more around security of supply, safety, loss of life protocols, those sort of things. And a lot of that early work in 22, 23 kind of pointed to their diesel systems and their existing systems, actually, for the most part, just upgrading those or adding it. It wasn't quite there yet, and we're seeing now with the newer prices, it's starting to make more sense. But then since then, we've had Eskom add just under 200 megawatts to the grid themselves, as well as South Africa's BSIP program. And that's really been used to kind of decongest the grid. So it's been placed in provinces that are previously quite congested in strategic locations. And that's been huge. It's all contracted PPAs, but it's been huge for the South African business because it set the scene and it seems to have catalyzed the market. So we seem to be able to leverage that now. There's skills transfer. It feels like another layer to what REAP did for us in the beginning. And I think there's also been a lot of learnings in this sort of contracted PPA space now. It's not big. I think it's 1,600 megawatts. But I think it's meaningful in terms of a first step. And that was recent. That's March 2023. So it's early days for us. But I do believe load shedding might have been the first of the dominoes. I think it would have come anyway, but it's definitely a first.
Yeah, so and I recall in the early stages of the Renewable Energy IPP program, or REAP, as you mentioned, it was all solar. No one spoke about batteries. I mean, this is now 10, maybe 12 years ago. Today, no one talks about large solar without considering storage. So definitely a significant shift that we've seen. So Gonzalo, it looks as though all good things come out of grid blackouts. I think Spain and Portugal's got their own little story around this, and it's a lot more recent, if I'm not mistaken. So it's very interesting. So, and I'm obviously talking about April this year when pretty much all of Portugal was out, and Spain declared a national emergency. So it was really significant. Now Spain is probably the country in the world with the most mature solar industry, also with storage. I mean, there's leaders and pioneers in CSP in the day. How is it possible that this could have happened in a country so completely in control of solar storage, and how has that changed the narrative in Europe?
I would say in Europe, Spain, Italy, the UK, the transition from what we had in the previous century to what we have today has been very gradual. In Europe, last century, most of our power generation was based on fossil fuels, coal and natural gas. And we had two, let's say, events that gradually lead to a renewable system. The first one is that we have a European Union that they decide from a political point of view, we have to become greener. And that was a political view, and there was some incentive to move in this direction. But on the other hand side, we had also a marginal market. So contrary to other places, such as South Africa, in Europe, every single power source is remunerated at the highest at that point. If you have a look to the PV is a complete revolution compared to what we had before. What we had before was very large facilities with a lot of people working on those. So it was a mix of a CapEx and an OpEx business. And you need people to work on the facility, you need the gas or the coal or whatever. Suddenly, PV is a CapEx business. You install the PV panels, the OpEx is negligible, and you don't have any raw materials to run your plant. So suddenly, PV becomes, in this marginal market, getting a lot of money because you cannot compare with the cost of running a natural gas facility, for instance. So suddenly, thanks to this, let's say, lack of OpEx, lack of raw materials, PV became, let's say, very attractive for investors. And the other important thing was that for PV, you don't need to go to a 1 gigawatt scale plant. You can go a few dozens of megawatts. So almost any player can enter in this business. So suddenly, we see in Europe, and mostly Spain, as you mentioned, how PV and other renewables are penetrating, and they are becoming more and more, let's say, present. And now we have an issue that started in the US, in California, the famous DAX curve, which is, okay, if you have a lot of sun, your demand, more or less, you can predict how your demand will be over the day. Suddenly, the sun rises, or your PV start producing. So let's say, if you take your net generation out of solar, you don't need almost any other sources. Even during midday, solar can meet the demand. But suddenly, the sun has the tradition to sunset every day. So you need to supply with a lot of power the evening and the night. And who is providing that? Right now, we have a lot of, or still a lot of backup, nuclear, natural gas, coal, depending on the market in Europe. Those plants are becoming less and less efficient because having a natural gas plant that rather than operating, I don't know, 6,000 hours per year, 7,000 hours per year, operating only 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, let's say half of what they were designed to perform, let's say all the maintenance costs, all the fixed costs are, let's say, allocated in a very tiny fraction of hours. So suddenly you see in Europe that there's a huge gap in this marginal market. So during the day, the price is very low, almost zero. In the night, you need to pay a lot to have this natural gas plant or up and running. So suddenly, we start seeing the business model for storage. So initially in Europe, I wouldn't say it was like coming from a drastic event, as Bruce mentioned in Australia. It was more let's say, a market opportunity to say, we see spreads, let's go and install batteries. And now we can go to April this year in Spain. Spain has been, let's say, proud of being the country in Europe with the highest renewable penetration. We have been running only on renewable for many days. Our hydro presence is significant. Still, as Bruce mentioned, it's difficult to grow more hydro capacity. So I always try to put like a metaphor, try to explain what happened in the blackout. You probably have heard in other forums the simile of the cycle, of you're going on a bike, and it's like your system. Let's imagine we have a bike, and each single, let's say, biker is one of a power generator. Let's imagine you have 10, just to say a simple example. You are cycling on a flat road, and you don't need the 10 people. Maybe 7 are cycling, the other 3 are just resting. On the first position, we have the operator of the system. We have the TSO. And he's the guy saying, we need more people cycling, or we need more people to rest. And this is the guy taking one road that might be, let's say, more, upwards or more downwards. And to me, that is like the demand. So if the road becomes more steeper, you have to, let's say, go higher. This lead person, the operator, needs to say to the other biker, please start pushing, start cycling. Otherwise, the bike cannot continue. And suddenly in Spain, we had on April, on the 20th of April, one of the bikers, he couldn't cycle anymore. He got tired, so he stopped cycling. And as the effort was becoming higher for the other, the second one decided to stop cycling because he couldn't continue. And here, and this is the key point, in my opinion, the operator is the one telling if we can continue this road or if we need to take a lower or a, let's say, more flat road. They didn't. So it is true that after 6 months, we don't have yet an official report that clearly set out responsibility. Of course, the operator, the TSO, is blaming some failures on some PV plant in the southern Spain. In my opinion, this is my personal opinion, this is not my company's or anybody else, just my Gonzalo Martin's opinion, is that you are the operator, you are the one allowing every single plant to be in the system. You are the one telling to the plant, you can operate, you have to shut down, you have to increase power, you have to decrease power. So to me, a failure in the system, it's due to the operators, let's say, lack of diligence, let's say so. But it is true that after that, and we can discuss a little bit later, there has been a change of mindset in Spain. Now we are saying, hey guys, renewables used to be amazing because they are green. We don't have any dependence on Russian gas. They are cheap. But what if they are not enough? And now we need to discuss about the storage and other things.
Yeah. Okay. Fascinating. I'm a cyclist myself, so I absolutely understand the analogy of going uphill. It's losing capacity in that space is never a pleasure. But Gonzalo, staying in Europe, Europe is possibly the biggest interconnected grid in the world, and at the same time, you've got on that grid possibly the highest variation in solar resource, right, from the north of Germany to south of Spain. Is this a problem for the grid? I mean, is there anything that how should the grid adapt to more injection of renewables, specifically solar, as you've mentioned. The sun has to go down at night, and that's a problem, right? How's the grid and even regional policy across Europe? How must that adapt to accommodate a greater penetration of solar and storage specifically?
I mean, to me, the grid is the biggest bottleneck for renewable expansion, and it's very simple. If you take a solar plant in southern Spain, a very sunny area, it uses the grid less than 25% of the year. Way less, let's say around 20. The other 80%, that cable is idle, is stopped. Nobody's using that. So we are coming from a framework in which each generator has its own cable, no matter you're using 100% or 10%. And what happens? That it's very, very expensive to keep building new interconnections. Moreover, if you are going to, let's say, underuse those, because I said PV 25%, if you take wind in Spain, it's around, again, another 20-25%. We don't have renewables having load factors above 50, just to say a number. So now we're in this point, and actually in Europe, it's becoming a reality finally in the last 2-3 years, that the governments, not only in Spain, also in other countries, for example, in Italy, they said, okay, this has no economic sense. Makes no sense to do a billionaire infrastructure to be used by some people only for a few hours. So now they are allowing to hybridize the connection point. So now if you have a solar plant, you can install in the same connection point a wind plant or a storage or anything that is renewable or with some, let's say, parameters. This, in my opinion, will be a key enable event to develop more renewables and be able to connect. If you go to any single country in Europe and you get how many connection requests are given by renewables, they are normally 3-4 times the size of the market. So it's impossible every single plant will be connected. And it's impossible that the TSOs or the government can afford to build so many infrastructure. So at the end, this, let's say, mindset of allowing the owner of the grid, or the user of the grid, who is the power plant, to share your grid with somebody else, I think there's going to be a new paradigm, and this is going to facilitate the storage in a fast penetration era.
Yeah. Okay, that's fascinating. I mean, obviously that sharing of grid connection would have to be across technologies, right? So, I mean, it's no point in having two large solar farms be pushing capacity onto the grid at the same times of the day. It would likely be better if there's wind, or then in context of our discussion, specific battery storage on that single connection point. Look, Bruce, coming to Australia, I think Australia is probably on the polar opposite of grid connection compared to Europe, with massive areas of unpopulated land between the west and the east, and even no physical connection between the east and the west grids. Does this make it more challenging for battery storage adoption, or is this actually an opportunity? I mean, how does the Australian grid, which is as a country a completely isolated grid, how does that need to change, or policy needs to change to accommodate this massive increase in battery storage that we're seeing in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, Australia is an enormous landmass, but it's one of the world's most urbanized cities, or not cities, but areas of the world. The vast bulk of its population relative to comparable either European or Anglo countries live in the cities. And Melbourne and Sydney are bigger than all cities in Europe. And so is Brisbane, the third biggest, excepting London. So it's a highly urbanized country. The distance between the west and the east is so large that electricity transmission is not feasible. And when you can produce electricity for comparable cost practically everywhere in Australia, and solar production costs are simply so low, who cares about another 5% yield? That argument's moved on. So it's all now about essentially access to demand. And although Australia is highly urbanized, it's got a massive agricultural sector who are very aware of their property rights. Now, after 150 years of European settlement, they've got an attachment to the land, and many of the farmers are quite wealthy, and so they identify more than just the income associated with their farms, but a sense of continuity. And so transmission construction has been extraordinarily contested in Australia. It also, in the south and eastern states, has a dividing range, which makes it expensive to move electricity over. There's a fair altitude difference across it. So all of that means I think the transmission debate in Australia is every bit as lively as I've seen it anywhere else. I think our institutions and our market operators made a huge mistake by seeking 500 kV interconnection between the states, all predicated really essentially on fossil fuel past, where fuel differences might have justified. It was tenuous at best, but might have justified transmission to be able to diversify production and cost differences. But now, as I say, solar is, who cares if you get 5% better yield here versus there? It's abundant everywhere. Not as good as Johannesburg and Durban with lovely winter sun, but still very good. So the massive transmission augmentations, which are predicated on interconnection and sharing production and sharing costs, just make no sense. And so they hit heavy water, and it's highly political. It's a big news story, and it's undermining the transition such that the transition large-scale wind and solar production in Australia has stalled. The stuff that's still going is distributed production, but wind, there hasn't been a new wind farm that's closed a deal in this year, which is quite astonishing. In addition, solar wind economics has changed massively, whereas per unit produced, solar was maybe 80% of wind 3 years ago. Now it's half of wind. And wind its complexity of construction is rising all the time. Solar is getting, through firms like yours and automation, and from China, all sorts of robots in the implementation, unit costs are declining all the time, not just in cell, but in the final product. So the storage, the future as we see it now is solar plus battery, and battery luckily is declining everywhere. Battery is still expensive if you don't use it every day. So if you're only using it infrequently, the economics become really quite problematic. But we're still miles from that. Even in Australia, where wind and solar is about a third of our production, we're still miles from that. So battery has a huge role in transmission expansion, in obviating the need for massive transmission augmentations by better utilizing current power lines. It's getting big take up in the C&I sector to manage peak demand charges, as well as shifting rooftop solar into the evening. And it's now getting in Australia, although we lag behind to some degree, the west coast of the US and Texas, we are now getting into the diurnal, regular daily shifting of production from the middle of the day to the evening through batteries. And there's a huge number of firms building them very quickly, and lots of smarts going into the optimization of the production and life extension and.
And James, I think moving into Africa, again, a very different grid, very different connectivity. In the north, we've got strong grids, mostly around Egypt and a little bit of North Africa. In the south, we've got a very mature grid. In South Africa, it's a very stable grid. It's not so much the generation always, but the grid's there, with a limited amount of interconnection into the north of the borders to weaker grids. Now, the critics of renewable energy always points to the variability of renewables and the impact that has, especially on weaker grids. How is this being dealt with in Africa? Because one would feel that solar with storage is kind of that cell phone leap. where you don't have to build massive grid infrastructure anymore into the rest of Africa or areas where there's typically not grid, and you can move distributed generation in there backed up by batteries. And of course, there's the story of the South African grid and the long transmission lines in there as well. How's the story around battery going to be changing our thinking around grid in Africa?
So we're definitely seeing a lot of projects now hybridizing, exactly as you say. So we're doing more PV battery combinations, particularly when you've got weak grid connections as well. The challenge, though, is the utilities we're connecting to don't always have a clear mechanism or space to actually arrange it. So a lot of the African countries don't really know how to digest these projects or have a space for these projects. So I think South Africa is fortunate in that it does have some policy. It's definitely behind what Bruce and Gonzalo are talking about. But the second you start going out into Africa, you can get it right, but it's also sort of setting up structures with off-takers, large mines, normally embedded generators. And then there are some projects with some of the larger utilities, but they're few and far between, and they take long to develop. So there's a lot of sort of institutional challenges, less than technical challenges. But that being said, PV and batteries are definitely going to be combined moving forward. It's almost a no-brainer. In the South African market, I think there's a lot of what Bruce and Gonzalo are saying echoed. We're also oversubscribed. We're seeing developers locally, we're to some extent calling it afterthought best, because they would have conceived and pre-developed a PV project. They would have grid connection for that PV project, and then they would sort of, while still keeping within the remits of their grid license, they would add a BESS simply to do load shifting, allow them to increase their capacity factor, provided the finances make sense. So we are still seeing a lot of movement on batteries despite the grid constraints, and it's to give them that flexibility we're seeing. And obviously we're hoping that eventually we'll see something around the ancillary services and stuff. But in the African context, the greater Africa context, I think we're going to see a lot of BESS moving forward, yeah.
I know Zutari has been involved with some BESS projects in Malawi, so we're certainly seeing some of that already happening. It's on the ground. So I want to move a little bit to the technology that we are expecting to see. I guess it's the more exciting stuff about what's coming next. And Bruce, I mean, I think in your position, maybe you have access to the latest research, the latest pilot projects. I mean, CSP has for long been the de facto technology for solar storage, but it has its own technical complications, and people prefer PV these days. But quite frankly, we just can't at the moment compete with the long-term storage that we can get out of a CSP. What's changing in that space? Where are we going? What can we expect next?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. My perception is CSP was further ahead relative to PV and lithium 10 years ago than it was 5 years ago than it is today. The plug-and-play nature of PV and lithium, and soon it'll be PV and sodium, it means you get factories, scale economies, specialization, implementation economies, and competition. CSP has been bespoke. One technology proved up after the next. Regenerating from the stored electricity and getting it back in a useful form has always required project-specific engineering and some level of R&D, despite many saying it's proven and known and what have you. Just the regeneration and the heat transfer processes, even when you're producing it for next to nothing, relative to lithium with its flexibility of instant response and secondary market and movability and implementation, blah, 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 has lagged behind. Storage economics, whether it's lithium or CSP, unless you are regularly diurnally shifting per unit of stored electricity over the production life of the unit, just like, as we were saying earlier, the economics of coal and gas is declining because the capacity factor is declining all the time because it's being pushed out of the merit order by wind and solar. So infrequently used storage is problematic. And the stuff that will win, I think, will be the lowest capital outlay technologies, just like we have diesel gensets all over the place in hospitals and buildings as backup, because it's infrequently used. Might have a high variable cost, but it's infrequently used. And in Australia, gas generation is getting a second bit of a policy push. I don't know if it's going to eventuate everywhere. I think essentially because of people, and this is my big policy gripe, I've had it for ages, seeking to solve the problem on the distant hills rather than the foothills. It's like climbing the Drakensberg, imagining that Cathkin Peak looks like this, but actually when you get up to the plateau, it looks completely different, and you'll adopt a completely different approach to it. Such is the energy migration, and the rate of technology development is just absolutely incredible at the moment, and has been for the last decade. We're anticipating solving these very distant problems, and then we look at just a year or two later, and the landscape changed totally. So right now we all say solar and BESS, and we talk grid connected. It might well be that the proliferation of storage in the economy, not just in large scale, but in devices, combined with orchestration and integration, means the winning combination is increasingly micro and decentral and on customers' premises and so on. So where does a CSP fit in that world? It's a central technology which doesn't have that flexibility of big and distributed that batteries and certainly solar have.
Yeah. So Gonzalo, I'd love to get your view on that. I've got another question for you as well on the tech, but maybe just your view on the CSP storage versus battery storage. I mean, how's the technology shifts there? I mean, what are we seeing in CSP happening, and what are we seeing in batteries in your space?
Before going to that, let me follow up on Bruce. I want to be a little bit, let's say, disruptive in this podcast. So let's think about one thing. PV, we said that had a very big market opportunity to enter because it was cheaper than fossil fuels. So suddenly we start seeing a lot of PV. Today in Southern Europe, generating 1 kilowatt hour in summer at midday has no value. It worth €0. So many people or many investors that they deploy PV, now they have an issue because we have commercial curtailment. So we have negative pricing or zero pricing. So suddenly a significant fraction of your time, your facilities shut down or makes no revenues. Now we see the new holy grail, which are the batteries. Oh, no problem, because of course I can continue developing PV because I will have batteries taking that energy and moving whenever it's needed. However, with batteries will be the same situation as with PV. The more batteries, the lower the spreads and the higher the cannibalization. So will be some point that batteries will not have as a business case anymore. So I remember I studied IT. So when I was younger, in Europe, in Spain, we had to pay for every minute you were on the phone. And when you were connected, you have to pay for every minute you were connected. That was changed for pay-per-use to now you have your line, and no matter how many times you call your mother, it's the same price. No matter if you are downloading film from the internet, it's a flat. What about if eventually the electricity becomes a commodity and we don't pay anymore per use or per consumption, but per capex? Because eventually, maybe you pay whatever number of euros per house and you get free electricity every time. That will be a very good signal price to the market to say, okay, this is a capex business, not an opex business anymore. So if I install batteries and I get a fixed payment over a number of years, I get whatever return rate is decided, I will happily invest in that business. Today, it's a very difficult market in the long term because you know that prices will go down. Going back to your question, Paul, CSP. I started my career in CSP early 2000s. At that time, we were still comparing CSP versus PV prices. I was in the CSP team, and some other colleagues were in the PV, and we were somehow competing. Hey, I'm expensive, or you're more expensive, or I'm cheaper. Suddenly, PV was much cheaper, and we said on the CSP side, oh, but we have a storage. So we are, okay, you're cheaper, but we can store the electricity. Suddenly, they came with the batteries and say, okay, now we're cheaper and we have batteries. The only thing that CSP has and PV doesn't is inertia to the system. We, and you mentioned before, Paul, in Europe is a very well interconnected grid, plenty of fossil fuels with turbines, so has a robust system. The more PV we enter into the system, the grid becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. So to me, the big, let's say, technological shift for PV in the medium term would be any kind of, synchronous compensator. Try to emulate this inertia, because otherwise your grid becomes so weak that, and Bruce mentioned this, you need batteries to start compensating some of the frequency deviation. In the UK, we have like 5 gigawatt, not weak. There are like 5 gigawatt of batteries already connected. All of them are very short duration, no more than 2 hours. And the revenue stacking is not energy shifting. They are not moving from midday to the night. They are just giving services to the grid. To me, start thinking in how we are going to preserve our system, moreover after the Spanish blackout in Europe. To me, it's crucial. I'm also going to give this reflection for people to think about it, whether or not electricity will become a commodity and you will pay as a fixed fee per month and not anymore per kilowatt hour.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating concept because PV and batteries is a capital play, right? It's not an operational play, which is a complete shift from where we're coming from, the heavy operational infrastructure like coal and gas. Yeah, it's a super interesting insight. So James, I before we go to the next topic, I do want to touch on this the pump storage topic. Many people see this marriage between hydro and solar as being the holy grail of storage and beautiful clean power, but we just haven't seen that happening. I mean, we see in Australia with Snowy 2. It's not really what everyone was hoping it will be. South Africa is blessed with 4 pump storage schemes, and there's thinking around an extra one, but it's not really been the solution for storage. I mean, there's concepts that's been raised about storage as a service, where I guess pump storage could ideally play an interesting role. How do you see that, the future of? I mean, is there a marriage, or is this kind of never going to happen?
It's hard to say if it's never going to happen. I think it's on one hand that question of decentralized versus centralized, and how PV and batteries can scale and be implemented sort of in an aggregated way. But we've also, to some extent, utilized the bulk of our key pumped hydro locations. So it's very much based on an appropriate topography. And South Africa is a water-scarce country. There are some locations, and I know that, as you just mentioned now, they're looking to sort of resuscitate some of these early ideas that Eskom's had in the past, and I know that's potentially quite exciting. But it's perhaps exciting in South Africa's context now, where we're still got a heavy coal fleet. We've got very low renewable energy penetration, and we've been struggling with load shedding up until more recently. So I don't know that it's necessarily a silver bullet or something we're gonna see a lot more of in South Africa. It might be a once-off, and then the capital costs are very high. It really requires. It's not something that's easily done by private investors. It's done through sort of very rigid government support. I do think that in terms of biggest response, and you can see it just in from March 2023 to now, how we've been able to, through the right mechanisms, put 1.6 gigawatts of batteries on our grid. Agreeably, some of those are still sort of being planning and developed now. They're not actually commissioned, but in terms of the pipeline, it's much more fast moving than a pumped hydro would be.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're looking at last pumped hydro, we're talking. It's a mining project, isn't it? I mean, it's underground caverns, it's long underground penstocks, and the moment you go underground, it's such a high risk in terms of geology, and you'd never know what you're going to end up paying, right? 100%. So with batteries, the container's going to cost me so much, and it's going to be there tomorrow, right? So I want to maybe just the last topic that I quickly want to discuss, and it's I guess a combination of both the global view of what's the best model as well as bankability, because those kind of go together. And maybe, Bruce, if I can first maybe just push this to you. We see a lot of different models, grid operating and commercial models around energy. And I think Gonzalo's radical view of pay per connection for energy is certainly out of the box thinking. What is your view moving forward? And I guess this is a global view of what kind of model do you think? Is there one that's going to be the one that's going to push the projects to bankability? Is it more complicated than that? I mean, we're talking about, especially in Europe, where we have multiple nations sharing a grid and potentially having to share a operating model. In Australia, it's maybe even at a state level complicated. Is there one solution that's going to work for us in accepting storage into our commercial energy models that's going to be applicable worldwide? I
think a categorical views on this stuff isn't helpful. It is so situation and time based. The picture has changed drastically in Australia over the last decade. Partly, largely because of technology change, the ever better economics and integration of battery and solar, not just unit cost, but packaging and operation and delivery, and the ability to get ever greater grid independence for all sorts of customers. That is at last creating a genuinely competitive electricity market. A market much as we consider the market for bread or for motor cars. It's exchangeable, fungible. You don't need a monopoly in between changing things. And so that's the story where Australia is now, a country with a large middle class, people able to find the capital to essentially self-supply, to be able to lay out that money and get price certainty for the foreseeable future. And available technologies that are becoming ever better for customers wanting that. So that is the direction of travel. At the same time, we've had enormous policy failures in the grid, in policy development. Essentially, policymakers sitting in ivory towers miles from actual consumers and actual geology and actual social license issues, making decisions, putting on enormous costs onto the system. Escoms have it, non-payment problems and, technology costs. We don't have the payment issues here, but we have the same enormous capital waste. And that's making grid supply ever more challenging relative to self-supply. And I can only imagine that trend continues. At the same time, governments stepping in to take on functions, and as governments invariably do, they make a big hash of it because the risk allocation is all wrong and they aren't accountable and they pick losers, one after the next. So that's where I see things changing. So specifically, if I was an investor with battery and solar, I would spend as much time worrying about operation and engineering and delivery as I would trying to find customers to locate next to me and, being able to supply them directly. And that's now, amongst the big utilities, an increasing thing. when they close their coal-fired generators, they talk about energy hubs. And what they mean is they'll put solar and battery and they'll find customers, data centers and others to come and locate there. And that's the pitch that the electricity suppliers are now increasingly looking for, but also the customers. And the mines are already largely self-supplied, and that trend will carry on. And it's only a question of time before CNI, shopping centres and what have you are largely self-supplied. As I see some are in Joburg, although for very, very different reasons there. But in terms of the fundamental economics, that's kind of where it's headed. And I think the big producers are kind of powerless to be able to improve government. I look at the challenges you guys face with Eskom and NERSA and policy development. It's one thing managing all your technology and your delivery risks for your PV and your battery. It's another thing getting policy land to work well and actually make things happen, build markets, regulate them effectively, not squander a whole lot of money on transmission connection assets that you forced to hand over to Eskom. So we don't have the same capacity challenges, but we do have the misallocation of capital challenges in the context in which customers have a alternative, and that for me is the very exciting thing.
Yeah. No, excellent. Thank you very much, Bruce. Gonzalo, maybe last question to you. What do you think is going to be the biggest shift in storage in the next 5 to 10 years? We all know the extreme drive in getting renewables on the ground in the world. We've now seen both at the G20 and at COP30 a commitment to tripling renewable energy in the near future. What do you think is going to be the biggest thing that's going to change in battery and storage to help drive this renewable adoption?
I would say the key point here would be bankability. The reason we have almost every single CSP plan being the same, which is the parabolic trough rather than the tower, is because in the US in the 80s, they had that technology and all the banks, let's say, felt comfortable financing those ones. So when we talk about batteries, right now, banks start to feel comfortable with one specific chemistry, might be others. The key point would be if new chemistries are, let's say, understood by the banks and therefore they are bankable, or whatever additional, let's say, improvement, let's say lower capex or higher performance, it's set off or not by the interest. Yesterday I was in London talking with some lenders, with some financial institutions, and one of them was complaining because he said, hey guys, the problem for us, he's a lender, is that all the upside from electricity goes to the equity, goes to the investor. And my counter response was, it is true, but also the full risk. A bank will never, ever, ever give you every single euro or rand or dollar of debt if you don't have contracted revenues. For PV or for power generation, more or less, it's everybody understands the business model. Is that, okay, I have this demand, could be higher or lower, I have this generation, and more or less people will pay to satisfy the demand. And somebody mentioned before that center that will be a huge increase in demand. So everybody understands the business model of a PV plant. Not everybody understands the business model of a battery. And here we have to be careful, or not careful, aware where is the business model in South Africa, Spain, or Australia, which are sunny countries. And those has a clear business model. Charge during the day, discharge later, in the evening or at night. From PV in Germany or the UK, they're not sunny countries, but they need to provide robust grid services. So to me, just to conclude, the major thing would be how this battery storage is going to be bankable, how they're going to predict revenues over the long term so banks can actually give you money on a long-term basis, and if new chemistries will be able to exceed the benefits of the current ones, taking into account that probably those ones will be more expensive to finance and to deploy capital.
Okay. Excellent. Gentlemen, Thank you so much. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but wow, I could have carried this discussion on for another hour. I really enjoyed it. Bruce and Gonzalo and James, thank you very much for this fascinating discussion around storage and the future of our grids. It's truly been engaging. Would have loved to have a little bit more of a discussion around topics. Maybe we'll get to some of those later on. As we move forward into a solar-powered planet, I think we all understand storage is going to be key, and we are really at the beginning. It's a super exciting journey. Very interested to see where we're going, and maybe in a while we'll connect again and just reflect on where we've come and where we're going. But yeah, thank you very much for your participation. It's been a fabulous discussion. Thank you very much.